Welcome back to the podcast. You are listening to Friday Talks. I'm your host, Kevin Friday. I've got with me uh, here in this podcast, Adam Daniel. We've been talking the last two segments in our series about governance, about organizational design and development, and we've expanded that into um, governance at a much broader level and structures and how structural inequality can perpetuate dysfunctional things in society. So, Adam, in the last segment, we started going into the macro level, and to end off, we touched a little bit on poverty, inequality. It ties a little bit into race because of the history, the legacy of slavery, and marginalization of indigenous peoples across North America and in Canada in particular. So just to touch on that, because you also raised a number of questions, and I think you raised questions about, well, how do we get people more engaged? How do we um, at, at what point are where can decentralization work? In what ways can it work? I mean, off the top of my head, I could think of, even if you just look at, without getting partisan, if you look at our political system, it's heavily party based. And
Mhm.
I've been questioning that for years, right? I'm not saying I would never, ever participate in a party ever again, because I once did. I won't say which party for now, but I think that there's something limiting about simply saying you got to stick to the party line. And really, when you understand what our parliamentary system is supposed to be about, it's ironic because it was probably engineered to benefit the ruling class, the kings, the lords, the barons, but it seemed like they couldn't get away with what they wanted to do without having a house for the common person. They used to call it common man, but we'll say common person today. And that's evolved since the Magna Carta to what we have today, which is a parliamentary system that is supposed to be a lower house, meaning a place where the common citizen is represented by a member of parliament, and an upper house that is where you have a place of second sober thought by people who are more established. Years ago, that would have been lords and so on. Now it's whoever the prime minister picks. But here's an interesting concept. Um, it's very party centric. The party whips members of parliament to vote a certain way. All parties do this. If the people can take the power back, what if they could take the power back from the party leadership by simply organizing around a person of influence in their community that can represent them, that is not necessarily going to kowtow to any particular party leadership. In other words, when that person goes to Ottawa, they are completely controlled by the groups of people, individuals at the grassroots that elected them, rather than the party structure, which has grassroots people in constant them, but it's still hierarchical and top down. So
Mhm.
just wanted your thoughts on that. Like, what's your thinking about that as a potential antidote to an organizational structure that is too distant from local communities?
Yeah, it's a really um, good point, Kevin, and it comes back to this topic of centralization versus decentralization. So if you have your classic party politics structure, within a parliamentary democracy, for example, the elected officials within that party are incentivized and coerced to vote along the party lines. Yet
Right.
in theory, those members, those politicians, are supposed to be directly representing the interests of their constituents, the ones who elected them. So, from the concept of a political party that prioritizes party interests or coerces members of the party to vote along certain lines actually runs counter to the principle of representative democracy. Now you can say, like, it is representative indirectly in certain ways, but at the same time, you're divorcing the connection from those elected officials supposed to be directly representing the interests of their constituents, and now having to vote and make decisions and support legislation that is decided by the party, which is a more centralized entity. So that, again, here's another example of how centralization becomes less representative, and if we're looking at democracy on a spectrum, correspondingly becomes less democratic. So to have a more representative society that's more diverse requires decentralized governance. And so I think a more fitting example of this would be municipal politics, whereas you have city councilors they're not affiliated with a party, and they're more directly accountable to their constituents in the community. So we have this direct line of connection to our representatives. Now, there are specific reasons why political parties exist, because you can consolidate resources, and it's easier to run elections, and you pool your money. But then at the same time, you see those corresponding problems of how it works against certain democratic principles. And the more centralized a structure is, then the more leeway there is for corruption within that system of other outside interests being able to sway, because you only have to convince one centralized node or a smaller node in the system to sway it to outside interests, as opposed to having to get everyone on board. So you see that how there are corresponding vulnerabilities and weaknesses to a centralized system. So I do think that the next evolution of society and governance for human civilization needs to be much more decentralized for these specific reasons. And of course, that, like I said earlier, that brings in its own challenges, and that requires us as humans to evolve to be able to function within a society that is that operates in that way. So we have to kind of step up our game to be able to be more empathetic, to be more understanding, to think more critically, and to get out of one of the dark sides of human nature, or the shadow side of human nature is an instinct towards tribalism, which can have positive aspects to it. Like this sense of needing for tribe and community and connection and belonging is I think a core human need. But the dark side of that is when the tribalism and the loyalty to our tribe ends up creating unnecessarily conflict and suffering, and in the worst case scenarios, like massive wars and bloodshed on the planet. And you see this at a lower level with partisan politics that they become so conflicted and so adversarial that can very easily become disconnected from the purpose of the politics, which is to serve the interests of the public. And then so that tribalism and that siloing and fracturing ends up breaking down the system or causing conflict in the system. And then the decision making and functioning of the system doesn't become aligned, or becomes relatively disconnected from the interest of the people in that system, or the people that system is supposed to be representing or acting on behalf of, if that makes sense.
I think a lot of that is due to the cult-like nature of political parties, that if you look at what motivate, and this is part of the incentive thing that you mentioned in the earlier segments, the way that our political system is structured, it is designed to incentivize those that have to work for the party, work for the politicians, or those that have a religious attachment to a particular ideological bent that would compel them to give their free time to go put up signs and so on and so forth. The problem with that is that you get into echo chambering. A bunch of people meet at the pub after putting up signs, and they're all wearing the same color jersey, and they're all giving high five. Look, we got that other team. And then if you're in a pub that is big enough for two teams, your team's on one side of the pub and the other team comes in and, oh, it's the other team wearing the other color jersey. We better, look at that. Right. And so this is where it can, and it's just human nature, right?
Yeah.
Playing on these tribal things are actually very human. I want to touch a little bit about that because I think here's where the racial component comes in that I just want to sort of touch on just for a brief minute, because a lot of people confuse this. A lot of people say there was a nice man in the United States and his name was Martin Luther King, and he said, don't look at a book by its cover, look at their content of their character. They say that that's the only thing that matters, and we should just simply press the reset button. 1968, we're pressing the reset button. All the racists go to bed one night, racist, and they wake up the next night, not racist anymore. See, problem solved. We can go back to what we were doing. Just forget about it. No problem. Nothing to see here. Okay, but there's all of this. We talked about structures, and this is a very interesting topic when it comes to specific groups. There were structures designed predominantly in the United States, but in Canada too, to disadvantage certain groups over other groups. Whether you're talking about slavery, Jim Crow laws in the United States, or even more or less overt forms of segregation that existed in Canada and Nova Scotia overtly. But a lot of people, I find, what they don't understand is that sometimes you do have to focus on a specific tribe that has been left behind, because what happens is that a system can be designed a certain way that if you come later to pass a law, it doesn't stop the system from perpetuating inequality independent of actors. Because, it's not just the redlining, it's everything in the United States or even in Canada, but mostly in the United States. The redlining, what it created, perpetuates itself, because now those areas that were redlined are lower risk, have lower investment, have lower property taxes, etc., and lower investment, that has created other problems that last decades. So when people say, well, just press the reset button, you can't. You can't just press the reset button. There are real surgical methods. I think what we've got to do is we've got to look at things we have to decentralize. I think you're right on that. I think we have to be surgical. I think where there are groups that have been impacted today by decisions made over hundreds of years or practices of over hundreds of years, you have to look at that surgically, whether you're talking about the Black community or in the case of the Indigenous community now with residential schools and all of the ongoing problems with negotiating land treaties and where pipelines can go. It's still an ongoing issue. And I think that pressing the reset button probably isn't possible. But I do agree with the other things you're talking about with reorganizing those broader structures, whether they be political structures or governance structures. So take us through the solutions then, because I think you're touching on them and you're coming close to the precipice of the overarching manifesto. So take us through that.
Okay. So, I mean, first of all, I'd have to come back to something I said in our first segment, is that, when we're looking at a system, particularly a complex system, there's no simple solution to any problem. And there's no mathematical formula that you can universally apply to deal with any complex social problem. So, with regards to your point about hitting the reset button, I don't think that it could ever be that simple to just hit a reset button. Is that we need to examine the very specific context and the nuances and the complexity within the systems that we live in, and what are the specific problems and contexts, and what are some of the primary causal root cause factors that have contributed to certain outcomes, and then to address those very specifically, like you said, surgically. So there's no one size fits all solution to any problem. We have to understand. So, you have certain issues around racial inequality, and you're absolutely right that, you can put a structure into place and it creates a certain pattern or a feedback loop that even when you remove the initial
Law or
condition,
mandate, right?
yeah, the conditions that created that pattern, the pattern will persist because it'll create a feedback loop, and that pattern will persist over time. There's a bunch of crazy experiments they've done with animals decades ago around one of the famous exercises with, it's not a very friendly exercise for the dog, but they put a dog in a cage and electrocuted it. There's like an electric floor, and the dog was trapped in the cage, and the dog was
Right.
freaking out. And then eventually they stopped electrocuting the dog and they opened the cage door, but the dog didn't move. It didn't leave the cage. Or no, sorry, they opened the door, but they kept electrocuting the dog, and the dog didn't leave. So this is a phenomenon that we see as part of human psychology, or
Right.
animal psychology, is that you have this norm, this condition that was created, and what it does to the brain is that the brain gets conditioned to believe that change is impossible, or becomes much more difficult to break out of that certain pattern, even if the conditions have changed. So there's this concept of learned helplessness, and I mean this would be like another fully other deep complex topic, but to really understand these types of social problems, it's really important to understand the psychology behind it, and particularly the intergenerational psychology and this concept of intergenerational trauma. So you see this, I mean, the classic example is with Indigenous peoples and the residential schools, is that you have a tremendous amount of trauma that was inflicted on an entire generation of people. And the human brain naturally copes in certain ways, and then it become very difficult to, when we're in a survival, like psychologically in a survival state, it becomes difficult to function, because we're overwhelmed by these traumatic experiences. And then what that can do, or more often than not does, is it perpetuates patterns of what they call intergenerational trauma. And they found there's a strong link between addictions and trauma, poverty and trauma, all kinds of social issues. So you can rewind, hundreds of years back, and we can look at, slavery in North America, and that trauma that may have been inflicted hundreds of years ago, even though the slavery itself has been removed, it no longer exists. Those cycles and the negative impacts and the consequences of that are still showing up today. So
Absolutely.
That requires specifically looking at these social problems and seeing, like, what can we do to rectify and to examine those social problems, and I'm not advocating any one specific solution, because I think that, like I said, any of these problems are complex, but I think when we're trying to understand these dynamics, I think it's important to understand, like, the psychological and the systems aspects and how that contributes to reinforcing certain patterns. And so we can see that in society, again, with like certain ethnic groups. We'll also see it in organizations, and it shows up, we see it in families. It shows up in a lot of different ways. And one of the first ways to address these problems is to become aware of them. And I think that that's why you see, unfortunately, like a lack of, many people have a lack of empathy in society for certain groups that are marginalized, because they don't understand the history of what contributed to these specific problems.
And they're very individualistic, right? That's a big thing. I'm an individual. I have a friend that's a member of this ethnic group, so I'm fine, right? They look at these problems as, I'm okay, Jack. I'm an individual. I didn't do a horrible thing. I'm not a bad person, so I don't want anything to do with critical race theory or any other attempt to examine how history impacts today, or how systems impact us today, so on and so forth.
Yeah. So, I mean, if we're bringing it back to something more practical, because again, these problems are so complex, and there's no one simple solution or answer. But if we're looking at it at a societal level, or looking at some of these complex social problems, I think what's critical is that we question what are the root causes, historically, psychologically, societally, structurally, that have contributed to shaping these social problems. And
Right.
so if we ask those questions and we inquire, what's at the root of this? What caused, like, okay, we have certain circumstances, we have these social problems, like whether they may be poverty, inequality, addictions. Why is it that someone or a group of people may be suffering this certain or living certain circumstances, living in a particular reality? And when we can understand the dynamics of what shapes and contributes to those problems, it allows us to, first of all, empathize with those people, or those groups, or anyone. And then that puts us in a better position to examine what are the root causes and then to address them. And, it's not easy, but unless we take the time to question the reasons behind certain phenomena, then we're not going to be able to solve the problems, because then we just reduce ourselves to these oversimplified interpretations of why something exists. Like,
Right.
people often say, oh, well, that person's a drug addict, they're just lazy, or whatever, and they don't understand that there's a huge link between addiction and childhood trauma. So a lot of these
Right.
people that suffer with substance abuse addictions have gone through horrific things in their life and just haven't been able to cope it. So the substance abuse becomes a way of dealing with pain, of medicating and masking the pain. And when we can
Escapism.
exactly, and so
Right.
when we can understand and empathize, then we're in a better position to be able to help and to be able to make a difference. So this idea of like just inquiring, so in we're talking like intervention or organizational development or conflict resolution, this idea of inquiry is really important. So like, let's ask ourselves the questions: why do these circumstances exist? Get to the deeper level and look at it from these different lenses, like history, psychology, the systems, like the incentive architecture that reinforces these problems. And then that allows us to understand it. And then when we understand a problem more deeply and what are the causal factors that have contributed to it, then we become empowered to do something about it much more effectively. And then that same principle of questioning relates back to something we talked about a little bit earlier, with this idea of like questioning our assumptions that our society is built on, right? So whether that's our life and society as a whole, right? So we have certain assumptions or certain values that societies, our structures and systems are oriented around, whether that's like profit or money or economic growth. Not to say that there's anything wrong with those inherently. It's just that, are they existing in balance with other really critical, important core values like health and happiness, well-being, sustainability? And so let's question those assumptions and see that if the systems and the values on which our systems are designed, are they actually designed in our well-being? So let's look at these systems, look at the political incentive structures. Let's look at how we live our own lives individually. Are we living in such a way that's aligned with what's best for us and that will allow us to be most healthy, happy, and live the most meaningful and fulfilling lives? So this idea of inquiry and questioning relates to many different things, not just solving complex social problems, but also re-engineering our society and redesigning it in such a way that's better for all of us, in terms of health and prosperity.
That's great. I think you've said a lot of things. Pretty much everything you've said, I agreed with. Um, uh, that's been my life, always questioning why things are the way they are, and questioning why you see subsets of populations that are marginalized, and why pathologies are developed in certain marginalized groups in certain economic classes, right? It's always fascinated me, and I was never satisfied with people's answers, because it was always the simple, well, their parents didn't do this or that, the parents didn't spank them enough or whatever, right? And it's
Yeah.
just, which never really fulfilled me. And in fact, I've come to question a lot of the methods that a lot of people have been using for a long time when it comes to educating or indoctrinating their children.
Yeah.
Corporal punishment, yelling, screaming, all these kinds of things. Do they really work? I think there's some evidence that questions that. And but of course, then you've got to look at all the overarching structures that can perpetuate the behavior that we do, that people do in their families and in their communities. So It's
Yeah.
a very fascinating topic. Any last words? Any final thoughts?
Um, yeah. So, I mean, I guess in summary, I think one of the first, critical things is to just open our minds to be more open-minded, to be more empathetic, and to question our assumptions about everything, about how we live our life, um, how we organize our society, what we most value, how the incentive structures of the system reinforce certain behaviors that may be counterproductive and harmful to others, to ourselves, or the planet. And to just start with that. And I think that's the first step to making the world a better place. And that includes questioning our governance structures. Is our current political system necessarily set up in the best way that serves the best interest of the public, from a health, prosperity, well-being, happiness perspective? And by asking those questions and then looking for alternatives, then we move the ball in the right direction, and we can start to evolve as a society that is continually evolving in such a way that builds a society that's more healthy, happy, and prosperous for everyone. So I guess I'd leave it at that. And yeah, thanks a lot, Kevin. I appreciate the invite to come on your podcast, and
No
very much a
problem.
pleasure being here.
No problem. Thank you very much, Adam. Do you advertise where you could be reached, or is that something you keep private for now? How do you feel about that?
No, absolutely.
No.
I can be reached. Good way to reach me is on LinkedIn. So my name's
Okay.
Adam Danio. So that's Adam Daniow on LinkedIn, and I can be reached via email at adam.danio, that's Daniow at syncresisconsulting.com. So
Great.
thanks again.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. Thank you for joining the Procast. Thank you all for listening to this edition of Friday Talks, our 3-part edition. And stay tuned and have yourself a very good week.